Back in 1993, in the quiet, upscale suburb of Hillside, Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, the M family lived in their grand 5-bedroom mansion. Life was good. Mr. and Mrs. M, both successful professionals, had little to worry about, except ensuring their 6-year-old daughter, Tsitsi, was well cared for while they worked. To make things easier, Mrs. M hired a nanny, recommended by a trusted colleague. The young woman seemed polite, hard-working, and well-mannered, and soon she became part of their household. Her duties were clear: take care of Tsitsi and help around the house. She was required to live in and sleep in the same bedroom as Tsitsi, but she had some weekends off. For months, everything was perfect, until Themba arrived. During the school holidays, the M family's teenage nephew, Themba, came to stay. It was supposed to be a fun, carefree visit. But on his very first night, something strange happened. Mr. M had gone on a business trip, and Mrs. M had gone on a night shift. When midnight approached, Themba lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was vast, eerily silent, until it wasn't. A deep, guttural, unearthly noise echoed through the halls. It came from downstairs, from the nanny's room. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something in between. Themba sat up, heart pounding. He strained to listen. Sleep was out of the question. He spent the rest of the night frozen in bed. At first light, he rushed to the maid, his voice urgent. "Did you hear that noise last night?" She blinked at him, confused. "Noise? What noise?" She seemed genuinely unaware. Disturbed, Themba confided in Mrs. M as soon as she returned from her night shift. But she brushed it off. Maybe it was a stray animal outside, or maybe he had imagined it. Days passed. Silence returned. Themba left. Life went on, until one fateful night. It was past midnight when the peace of the M household was shattered. A loud, guttural, terrifying roar filled the house. Mrs. M bolted upright in bed, eyes wide with terror. Mr. M was already alert, heart hammering. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "It's coming from Tsitsi's room." A cold dread settled over them. They jumped out of bed. The walls trembled with the deafening sound. It was coming from inside the nanny's room. Mr. M banged on the door. No response. Mrs. M's motherly instincts kicked in. Tsitsi was inside. Without hesitation, she threw the door open. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The nanny stood in the middle of the room, her body unnaturally stiff, her arms bent like claws, and she was roaring, not screaming, not growling, roaring, like a lion. Her eyes were wild, her face contorted. It was as if her body was no longer her own. Mr. M staggered back. Mrs. M's eyes darted to Tsitsi's bed. To her horror, the little girl was still asleep, deeply, unnaturally asleep. Even the earth-shaking noise hadn't woken her. This was not normal. The couple grabbed Tsitsi and fled the room, locking the door behind them. They tried calling Pachie, the woman who had recommended the maid, but she didn't pick up. They sat in their living room, huddled together, too afraid to sleep. The roaring continued for what felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Morning came. The maid woke up as if nothing had happened. She walked into the living room, where Mr. and Mrs. M sat waiting. The air was heavy. "Sit down," Mr. M said. His voice was like steel. They told her everything that had happened. The maid's face paled. She knew exactly what they were talking about. What was that? Mrs. M demanded. The maid lowered her gaze. I don't want to talk about it. That was the final straw. They gave her 2 months' pay and fired her on the spot. Days later, Mrs. M finally managed to speak to Patier, and when Patier heard the story, she had no idea, so she had to go and research the issue. She came back the following day. Mrs. M, you need to sit down. The truth was darker than they could have imagined. The maid, Patier revealed, had a secret past. It was said that she could transform, not physically, but spiritually, into a lion. She would roar like a wild beast. And worse, there were whispers, rumors that, during one of her episodes, someone had died. But no evidence was ever found. The case went cold. Mrs. M felt her blood run cold. When she told Mr. M that night, he just sat in a stunned silence. How did we survive that? He finally whispered. No one ever saw the maid again. But even years later, whenever Mr. and Mrs. M spoke of that night, a shiver ran down their spines, because some things can never be explained.